Imagine living in a place where everything was allowed, where money could buy any pleasure, where parties lasted for days, and no one cared about tomorrow. Sodom and Gomorrah were the paradise of lust, wealth, and corruption. But behind the luxurious mansions and grand temples, there existed a world of violence, betrayal, and limitless perversion. Women were treated as objects, children were sacrificed in dark rituals, and the poor were left to die in the streets until one day, everything ended in flames. What really happened in these cities? What was it like to live in a place where morality simply didn't exist? Discover now the dark truth about Sodom and Gomorrah. Imagine walking through a city full of lively markets where merchants traded gold, silver, and rare spices. The smell of roasted meat and freshly baked bread filled the streets. Men dressed in luxurious robes negotiated, while servants carried jars of oil and exotic wines. This was Sodom, a thriving commercial hub, where wealth flowed without limits. Yet this prosperity brought consequences that few noticed in time. Sodom and Gomorrah were located in an extremely fertile region near the Dead Sea. The fields surrounding the cities were abundant, providing wheat, barley, and juicy fruits. This rich soil allowed the inhabitants to amass wealth quickly. Trade flourished with caravans arriving from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other distant regions. The streets were bustling, filled with artisans, goldsmiths, and merchants showcasing their most expensive goods. The wealthiest lived in luxurious homes built of polished stone and adorned with fine imported fabrics. In the city center, imposing palaces reflected the grandeur of its most powerful residents. Parties were common, gathering nobles and influential merchants who flaunted their fortunes at extravagant banquets. Wine was never scarce, and food was served in excessive amounts. Yet there was another side to this wealth. Inequality was evident. While the rich feasted, the poor were ignored, and those who had more than they needed offered no help. The culture of Sodom did not value compassion. Kindness was seen as weakness. Trade was also marked by greed. Tampered weights were used to deceive buyers. Merchants charged exorbitant prices, and the powerful exploited workers mercilessly. If someone fell into debt, they could easily be sold into slavery to pay their bills. Justice favored the rich, while the poor had no one to turn to. Outwardly, the city was a spectacle of wealth, but internally, it was a place where arrogance and exploitation reigned. For those with money, Sodom was a paradise. For those without it, it was hell on earth. Yet Sodom's wealth brought something even worse, a society that believed it was untouchable. They thought they would never face consequences for their way of life. However, the fate of these cities was already sealed, and their destruction would arrive in an overwhelming manner. What follows might be exactly what you need to know about the true face of Sodom and Gomorrah. But if you believe that greed and selfishness still corrupt our society, declare your faith in the comments. Right now, my trust is in God, not in riches. Let's show that there's a better path than the pride of Sodom. Architecture and city organization, the outer glow, inner rot. If you arrived in Sodom for the first time, you would be impressed. From a distance, the city seemed like an advanced civilization for its time. The walls were high, the towers rose over the hills, and the main streets were always bustling with life. Merchants shouted their offers amidst hurried crowds, while priests performed rituals in grand temples dedicated to pagan gods. But a closer look revealed that behind this facade of wealth and progress lay an environment of corruption and decadence. Sodom and Gomorrah were not small towns. They were influential urban centers situated in a strategic location near the Dead Sea. This positioning favored trade and communication with other peoples, making the cities obligatory stopovers for merchants and travelers. The architecture was impressive for the time. There were palaces, luxurious mansions, spacious squares, and majestic temples. The houses of the richest were made of polished stones, with imposing columns and internal courtyards decorated with statues and mosaics. The squares were the heart of the city. During the day, these places buzzed with commercial activities. Merchants traded fabrics, jewelry, and rare spices. Some sold perfumes brought from Egypt, while others offered hand-embroidered carpets from distant lands. But at night, the scene changed drastically. The same squares used for trade during the day turned into places of wild parties and pagan rituals. Musicians played flutes and drums while crowds indulged in provocative dances and religious ceremonies involving sacrifices and immoral practices. Despite all this apparent splendor, the city was chaotic for those who didn't belong to the elite. The secondary streets and dark alleys were dangerous. There were no laws that truly protected the weakest. Those who were robbed or attacked rarely found justice. If a crime occurred, the victim was often ignored, while the perpetrators continued their lives without any punishment. Judges and rulers were corrupt and only favored those who could offer them something in return. The poor neighborhoods were far from the central areas. In these regions, the streets were narrow and filthy, full of makeshift shacks. The residents lived in precarious conditions without access to basic resources, while the rich feasted. Even a piece of bread was hard come by. And worse still, there was no compassion. The culture of Sodom and Gomorrah did not encourage charity or solidarity. On the contrary, the needy were seen as useless, and helping the weak was considered a waste of time. In the noble areas of Sodom, pagan temples dominated the landscape, dedicated to deities associated with fertility and pleasure. The priests held great political and economic power, and their rituals blended religion with sensual excesses, contributing to the city's decadence. The city, relying on its wealth and high walls, neglected security, which would later prove fatal. While Sodom shone on the outside, inside it was a decayed society where only the strongest and most greedy survived. Pleasure was the only law, and the city had become a center of hedonism. Endless parties, luxurious banquets, and immoral behaviors were common. Marriages were seen as economic agreements, and infidelity was expected, not questioned. Pagan temples promoted orgiastic rituals, believing such practices attracted blessings, but in reality, they only deepened the depravity. The city took pride in its lack of moral rules, and the consequences were visible. Violence spread, and any conflict resulted in murders. Corruption was at the heart of the people, and relationships were based solely on desire and momentary interest. The city, obsessed with pleasure, was on the brink of ruin, but the people did not perceive the impending destruction. Violence in the streets was constant, and the justice system was non-existent. The rich escaped crimes through bribes, while the poor were ignored or ridiculed. Foreigners who arrived were seen as easy prey, and were often attacked and humiliated. In Sodom, violence was not only tolerated but encouraged, and youth demonstrated their cruelty as a rite of passage. The city lived in a spiral of excesses, unaware that its obsession was destroying its own society. Empathy disappeared in Sodom. The suffering of others became a spectacle, and the poorest were the most affected, living on the streets without protection, while the wealthy isolated themselves in their mansions. Women and children were the most vulnerable, and the justice system was completely corrupt, allowing false accusations to lead to death without defense. The pride and arrogance of the rulers created a false sense of invincibility, and the city descended into chaos. Respect for life and morality vanished, and every person only saw others as opportunities for personal gain. Society treated women and children as disposable commodities without value, and marriages were seen only as political or economic arrangements. Widows and children, especially the poor, lived on the margins, being exploited or sold as goods. Pagan rituals were cruel, and even children were sacrificed on altars to please the gods. Selfishness prevailed, with complete indifference to the needy, who were despised and ignored. The city was drowning in wealth and pleasure, while the poor starved to death on the streets. Indifference to the needy was one of Sodom's greatest sins, and selfishness ruled over all. Compassion was non-existent, and those who were poor or foreigners were mistreated, ridiculed, and even killed. The lack of solidarity was widespread, and even within families, love had disappeared, replaced by individual survival at any cost. This moral and social decay made the destruction of Sodom inevitable, as the city ignored the warning for change. What seemed to be a place of power and prosperity was, in reality, rotten from within, and its end was near. Sodom and Gomorrah were corrupted by perversion, violence, and the absence of compassion. The city, built on selfishness and pride, was about to collapse, and no one imagined the end was so near. The last day of Sodom began like any other, with banquets, markets, and temples filled with profane rituals. The city was immersed in luxury and arrogance, living only for pleasure, without realizing it was on the brink of destruction. The night before, two mysterious strangers arrived in the city. What the inhabitants didn't know was that these travelers were angels sent to destroy Sodom. The house where they were staying was surrounded, and the inhabitants demanded that they be handed over. But a blinding light struck the attackers, signaling that Sodom's time had come to an end. The next morning, the angels issued a clear warning to Lot, one of the few righteous men. He should leave immediately with his family, because the city was about to be destroyed. Lot hesitated, but eventually fled with his family, while the rest of the population continued to ignore what was about to happen. And then came the moment that would forever change the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The sky, which had been blue and bright until then, began to darken. Heavy clouds appeared out of nowhere, bringing a strange, suffocating sensation. The wind changed, and a heavy silence took over the city. People began to wonder what was happening. And without warning, the first fiery bolt fell from the skies. Seconds later, flames began to rain down like an infernal storm. Sulfur and fire consumed everything they touched. Wealthy homes crumbled. Temples exploded into flames. Markets were destroyed in moments. Men and women ran desperately, trying to find shelter, but there was nowhere to escape. The heat was unbearable. The air was filled with smoke and cries of despair. The mansions, once symbols of luxury and ostentation, were now just piles of ashes. The streets, once filled with parties and sins, were now covered in charred bodies. Those who tried to flee were quickly consumed by the fire. It didn't matter if they were rich or poor, powerful or slaves. On that day, everyone faced the same fate. The city that defied any sense of morality for so long now became a desert of destruction. But amidst the chaos, a small group ran across the plains, moving away from the inferno consuming Sodom. Lot and his family were alive. They had escaped, but the warning had been clear: do not look back. It was then that his wife, overcome with attachment to the city, made a fatal mistake. She stopped, turned to look, and at that moment, her body hardened. Within seconds, she transformed into a pillar of salt. Her heart still belonged to Sodom, and for that, she met the same fate as the city. When everything was over, what had once been a thriving metropolis was now just a desert of smoldering ashes. Nothing remained, no trace of its former glory. Just charred ruins and the smell of sulfur in the air. The city that had believed itself untouchable for so long was destroyed in a single day. Pride, depravity, and lack of compassion led Sodom and Gomorrah to their end. And this story serves as a powerful reminder. No civilization, no matter how rich and powerful, survives when it chooses to defy all principles of justice and kindness. If this story impacted you, leave a like now as an act of reflection on the importance of choosing a path of righteousness. This was only the beginning. Betrayal has always existed, and even in the Bible, we find shocking stories of women who were unfaithful to their husbands. But what were the consequences? What happened to them? Click now and discover the most impactful cases of betrayal in the Bible and the lessons we can learn from them.